Sometimes the most unexpected heroes appear when we need them most. In a world where people often walk past suffering, where age is dismissed and dignity forgotten, one moment can change everything. This is the true story of how a Hollywood action star became a real-life hero for an elderly woman facing her worst nightmare in public. It's a reminder that fame means nothing compared to basic human decency, and that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can restore our faith in humanity. What happened that Tuesday morning at Wells Fargo would become a story shared millions of times across social media, not because of celebrity drama or scandal, but because it showed us who we can be at our best. This is about Margaret Chen, a 78-year-old retired teacher whose simple trip to the bank turned into a humiliating ordeal that almost broke her spirit. And it's about Mark Sinclair, better known as Vin Diesel, who proved that being tough on screen means nothing compared to being gentle with someone who's hurting. Get ready for a story that will make you believe in the power of standing up for others, even when cameras aren't rolling. Margaret Chen adjusted her reading glasses one more time as she approached the imposing glass doors of the Wells Fargo branch on Sunset Boulevard. At 78 years old, she had been coming to this same bank for over 15 years, ever since her late husband Walter had opened their joint account here. The familiar routine of her monthly banking visit usually brought her comfort, a small piece of normalcy in a life that had become increasingly lonely since Walter's passing 3 years ago. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor as Margaret stepped inside, her sensible shoes making soft clicking sounds that echoed in the spacious lobby. She carried her worn leather purse close to her chest, the same purse Walter had given her for their 40th wedding anniversary. Inside, carefully organized in a small envelope, were her social security check, her pension payment, and a handful of bills she needed to pay. Margaret had never been comfortable with technology. While other seniors had embraced online banking and ATMs, she preferred the human interaction of speaking with a teller. It made her feel less alone, even if the conversations were brief and professional. Today, like every month, she planned to deposit her checks, withdraw enough cash for her modest expenses, and perhaps exchange a few pleasant words with whoever helped her. The bank was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning. Margaret counted at least 12 people ahead of her in line, some checking their phones impatiently, others shuffling documents in their hands. She didn't mind waiting. At her age, she had learned that patience was often the only thing that separated a good day from a frustrating one. She found a spot at the end of the line and began her wait, occasionally glancing around at the familiar surroundings. Behind the counter, she could see 3 tellers working. There was Jennifer, a young blonde woman who had helped her several times before and was always kind. Next to her stood Marcus, a middle-aged man with a warm smile who knew Margaret by name. At the far end was someone Margaret didn't recognize, a thin woman with dark hair pulled back severely, who seemed to be moving through customers with mechanical efficiency. As the line slowly moved forward, Margaret couldn't help but overhear fragments of conversations around her. 2 businessmen were discussing a merger deal worth millions. A young mother was trying to calm her crying baby while managing paperwork. An elderly man in front of her was muttering under his breath about interest rates and government policies. Margaret found these glimpses into other people's lives oddly comforting. Everyone had their struggles, their concerns, their daily challenges to navigate. When Margaret finally reached the front of the line, the electronic voice announced, "Next customer, please proceed to window 3. Window 3 was staffed by the unfamiliar teller with the severe expression. Margaret approached with her usual polite smile, ready to conduct her business as efficiently as possible. "Good morning," Margaret said pleasantly, placing her envelope of documents on the counter. "I'd like to make a deposit and withdrawal, please." The teller, whose nameplate read Sarah Mitchell, barely looked up from her computer screen. "ID and account number," she said curtly, extending her hand without making eye contact. Margaret fumbled in her purse for her driver's license, her arthritic fingers making the simple task more challenging than it used to be. She also pulled out her account information, written in Walter's careful handwriting on a piece of paper she had been using for years. Sarah snatched both items without a word and began typing aggressively on her keyboard. After several minutes of typing and frowning at her screen, Sarah looked up with obvious irritation. "This account information is outdated. The account number format changed 2 years ago. Don't you have your current debit card?" Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. "I'm sorry, I don't use the debit card much. This is the same account number I've always used. My husband Walter set it up, and I've never had any problems before." "Well, you're having problems now," Sarah replied, with barely concealed impatience. "I can't process anything without proper current account information. You need to update your records." The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other customers and staff. Margaret felt her cheeks growing warm with embarrassment. She had never experienced anything like this before. Every other teller had been able to help her without issue. "Is there perhaps another way to verify my account?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have my social security card, and I know my account balance from my last statement." Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. "Ma'am, I can't just take your word for things. Banking regulations exist for a reason. If you can't provide current valid account information, I cannot help you. You'll need to speak with an account manager to update your records, and they're all busy with appointments today." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This simple transaction that usually took 5 minutes was turning into a nightmare. She was aware that other customers behind her were getting restless, some sighing audibly or checking their watches pointedly. "Please," Margaret said, her voice beginning to shake slightly, "I just need to deposit these checks and get a little cash." "Kidnak Baba Bo." "I've been banking here for 15 years. Surely there's something you can do." Instead of showing compassion, Sarah's expression grew even more annoyed. "Ma'am, I've explained the situation. You're holding up the line for other customers who have their paperwork in order. Either you can provide current account information, or you need to step aside and make an appointment with customer service." The humiliation was overwhelming. Margaret had served as a high school English teacher for 35 years, commanding respect from students, parents, and colleagues. She had raised 3 children, managed a household, and supported Walter through his own career challenges. Now, she was being treated like an incompetent child who couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities. Her hands began to shake as she tried to gather her documents. The check she needed to deposit represented her entire income for the month. Without access to her account, she wouldn't be able to pay her utilities, buy groceries, or cover her prescription medications. The practical implications of this situation were terrifying, but the emotional impact was even worse. "I don't understand," Margaret said, her voice now clearly audible to everyone nearby. "I've never had trouble before. These are the same documents I always bring. Why is this happening now?" Sarah's response was loud enough for half the bank to hear. "'Cause you're not keeping up with modern banking requirements, ma'am. This isn't 1985. Banks have security protocols now. If you can't adapt to basic changes, maybe you need someone else to handle your finances for you." The suggestion that she was too old or incompetent to manage her own affairs was the final blow. Margaret felt as though she had been slapped. Tears began flowing freely down her cheeks as she stood there, frozen with shock and humiliation. The entire bank seemed to be watching her fall apart in public, and she had no idea how to make it stop. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations and feel the weight of judgmental stares. Some people were clearly frustrated by the delay she was causing. Others seemed uncomfortable witnessing her distress but unwilling to intervene. Margaret had never felt so alone and helpless in her entire life. The bustling bank continued its operations around her as she stood there crying, holding her precious documents, and wondering how a simple banking transaction had become such a devastating ordeal. She had no way of knowing that her worst moment was about to become the catalyst for something beautiful, or that help was already walking through the front doors of the bank. Mark Sinclair had been having the kind of morning that reminded him why he loved Los Angeles despite its chaos. His workout at the gym had gone well, his meeting with his agent had ended earlier than expected, and he had decided to stop by the bank before heading to the studio for costume fittings for his next film. At 49 years old, the man the world knew as Vin Diesel had learned to appreciate these quiet moments between the intensity of filming and promoting his movies. He parked his black Dodge Charger in the lot behind the Wells Fargo building, chuckling to himself at how his choice of vehicle had become such a part of his public image, thanks to the Fast and Furious franchise. Sometimes life imitated art in the most amusing ways. He grabbed his sunglasses from the dashboard and headed toward the bank entrance, planning to make a quick deposit and be on his way. The moment Mark stepped through the glass doors, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The usual hum of normal banking activity was disrupted by an undercurrent of tension that he had learned to recognize over years of reading room dynamics on film sets. Conversations seemed muted, and several people were glancing toward the teller windows with expressions that ranged from curiosity to discomfort. As his eyes adjusted to the interior lighting, Mark quickly identified the source of the disturbance. At window 3, an elderly Asian woman stood with her shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a handful of papers. Behind the counter, a teller was speaking in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, her tone sharp with impatience and condescension. "Ma'am, I've told you multiple times that I cannot help you without proper documentation." You're disrupting the normal flow of business for other customers. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Mark felt his jaw tighten as he watched the scene unfold. The elderly woman was clearly distressed, but instead of offering assistance or showing basic human kindness, the teller seemed more concerned with moving her along to deal with the next customer. The woman looked fragile and confused, exactly like his own grandmother had during her final years when simple tasks had become overwhelming challenges. Several other customers in line were shifting impatiently, some checking their phones or making audible sighs of frustration. A few seemed genuinely concerned, but appeared unsure about whether to intervene. The overall atmosphere was one of collective discomfort, as if everyone was witnessing something unpleasant but felt powerless to address it. Mark had grown up in a household where respect for elders wasn't just encouraged, but demanded. His mother had raised him and his siblings to understand that age brought wisdom and deserved honor, regardless of someone's current capabilities. Seeing this woman being treated with such dismissive cruelty triggered something deep in his core values that he couldn't ignore. Without thinking about potential consequences or publicity implications, Mark stepped out of line and walked directly toward window 3. His movement caught the attention of several other customers, some of whom recognized him immediately. He could hear whispered conversations beginning behind him, but his focus remained entirely on the distressed woman at the counter. "Excuse me," Mark said, his voice calm, but carrying the kind of authority that came naturally to someone accustomed to commanding attention on film sets. He positioned himself slightly to the side of the elderly woman, close enough to offer support but not so close as to invade her personal space. "Is there a problem here?" The teller, Sarah, looked up, and her eyes widened as she recognized one of Hollywood's most recognizable action stars standing at her window. For a moment, her harsh demeanor faltered as she processed the unexpected development. The elderly woman turned toward Mark with surprise, her tear-filled eyes reflecting confusion about why a stranger was involving himself in her situation. "Sir, this is a private banking matter," Sarah said, attempting to regain her composure and professional authority. "This customer is having difficulty providing proper account documentation, and I'm trying to explain our security procedures." Mark glanced down at the elderly woman, noting her careful appearance and the organized way she had arranged her papers on the counter despite her obvious distress. Everything about her suggested someone who was normally well-prepared and responsible, not a person who would come to a bank without proper documentation unless something unusual was happening. "What's your name, ma'am?" Mark asked gently, turning his full attention to the woman while ignoring the teller's attempt to control the situation. "Margaret Chen," she replied in a shaky voice, using her sleeve to wipe tears from her cheeks. "I've been banking here for 15 years and I've never had problems like this before. I don't understand what's happening." The simple dignity in her response, combined with the obvious pain in her voice, confirmed Mark's instinct that this situation was being handled poorly. He had dealt with enough bureaucratic nonsense in his own business dealings to recognize when someone was being unnecessarily difficult rather than genuinely helpful. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Mark," he said, offering his hand in greeting. "Would it be all right if I tried to help figure out what's going on with your banking situation?" Margaret looked at this large, kind-faced man who had materialized beside her like an answer to a prayer. She didn't recognize him as a famous actor, but his gentle manner and willingness to help a stranger touched something deep in her heart. After feeling so alone and helpless just moments before, having someone treat her with basic human decency felt like a miracle. "Yes, please," Margaret said, managing a small smile through her tears. "I just need to deposit my checks and get some cash, but she says my account information is wrong, even though it's the same information I've always used." Mark turned his attention back to the teller, his expression friendly but firm. "Sarah," he said, reading her nameplate, "I'm sure you want to help Mrs. Chen resolve this situation. She's been a loyal customer for 15 years. Isn't there a way to verify her account using the information she has?" Sarah found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. She was aware that other customers and bank employees were now watching the interaction with intense interest. Being publicly questioned by a celebrity about her customer service was not something she had expected to deal with during her shift. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but banking regulations require specific documentation," Sarah replied, trying to maintain her position while being more careful about her tone. "I can't make exceptions, even for long-term customers." Mark nodded thoughtfully, then asked, "What specific documentation would help Mrs. Chen access her account? And is there a supervisor or manager available who might have additional options for resolving this?" The questions were reasonable and posed in a professional manner, but they effectively put Sarah on the spot to either provide constructive solutions or admit that she hadn't been trying very hard to help. The growing audience of onlookers made it clear that her handling of the situation was being evaluated not just by a celebrity, but by the bank's other customers as well. Meanwhile, Marcus, the teller at window 2, had finished helping his customer and had been observing the situation with growing concern. He recognized Mrs. Chen as a regular customer who had never caused problems before, and he could see that the situation was escalating unnecessarily. During a brief lull in his own line, he decided to step over and offer assistance. "Mrs. Chen?" Marcus called out, approaching window 3 with a warm smile. "I remember you. You usually come in around this time each month. I think I can help you with your banking today." Margaret's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Here was someone who recognized her as a person rather than treating her like a nuisance to be disposed of quickly. Mark stepped back slightly to give Marcus room to work while maintaining his supportive presence beside Margaret. "Thank you so much," Margaret said to Marcus. "I have my checks to deposit and I need to get some cash, but there seems to be some confusion about my account information." Marcus examined Margaret's documents quickly and efficiently. Within moments, he had located her account, using a combination of her social security number and driver's license information. "Here we are, Mrs. Chen. Everything looks perfectly fine with your account. Let me take care of these deposits and your withdrawal right away." The contrast between Marcus's helpful professionalism and Sarah's obstructive behavior was stark and obvious to everyone watching. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment as it became clear that the problem had been her unwillingness to make a reasonable effort rather than any actual regulatory barrier. As Marcus began processing Margaret's transaction, Mark remained beside her, making gentle conversation to help her recover from the emotional trauma of the previous few minutes. He asked about her family, complimented her on her organized approach to her banking, and shared a few light stories that made her laugh despite her recent tears. The other customers in line, who had initially been frustrated by the delay, found themselves drawn into the unfolding drama of kindness triumphing over bureaucratic cruelty. Several people began openly discussing how impressed they were with the famous actor's intervention and how poorly the original teller had handled the situation. Margaret's transaction was completed smoothly and efficiently, exactly as it had been every month for the past 15 years. As Marcus handed her the receipt and her cash, she turned to Mark with tears of gratitude replacing her earlier tears of humiliation. "I can't thank you enough for helping me," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared and embarrassed. I didn't know what I was going to do."
Mark smiled warmly, understanding that her gratitude was about much more than completing a banking transaction.
For Margaret, his intervention had restored her dignity and reminded her that she wasn't alone in the world. For him, helping her had been the most meaningful part of what had started as a routine day. As Margaret finished organizing her receipt and cash in her purse, Mark realized that simply resolving her banking issue wasn't enough. The emotional trauma she had experienced was written clearly across her face, and he could see that she was still shaking slightly from the stress of the confrontation. His protective instincts, honed through years of looking out for his film crews and fellow actors, told him that walking away now would leave an important job unfinished. "Chen," Mark said gently, "would you like to sit down for a few minutes? There's a seating area over there where we could talk, and you could collect yourself before heading back out into the world." Margaret looked toward the comfortable chairs arranged near the bank's windows, then back at this kind stranger who had transformed her worst morning in years into something bearable. The idea of having a few minutes to recover before facing the outside world felt like an incredible gift.
"That would be wonderful," Margaret replied, allowing Mark to escort her to the seating area.
"But I don't want to keep you from your own banking business." Mark waved off her concern with a gentle smile. "My business can wait. Right now, making sure you're okay is much more important." As they settled into the cushioned chairs, Margaret found herself studying Mark's face more carefully. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place exactly what it was. He had kind eyes and a gentle manner that reminded her of her late husband Walter, who had always been quick to help anyone in need. "I have to ask," Margaret said hesitantly. "Do we know each other from somewhere? You seem familiar, but I can't quite place you." Mark chuckled softly, a sound that immediately put Margaret at ease. "You might have seen me in movies. I'm an actor. My stage name is Vin Diesel, though my real name is Mark Sinclair. I've been in some action films that your grandchildren might know about." Margaret's eyes widened slightly as the recognition dawned on her. "Oh, my goodness. My grandson Tommy is always talking about those car movies. The Fast and Furious ones, right? He has posters of those cars all over his bedroom wall. That's right, Mark confirmed, pleased by her connection to his work through her family. How old is Tommy? He's 16 now, Margaret said, her face brightening as she talked about her grandson. He's obsessed with cars and always talking about becoming a mechanic. He would absolutely die if he knew I was sitting here talking with you. Mark pulled out his phone and smiled mischievously. Well, maybe we should do something about that. Would you like to take a picture together that you could show him? Or better yet, maybe we could call him and I could say hello. The suggestion clearly delighted Margaret, but she also looked uncertain. Oh, I couldn't possibly impose on you like that. You've already done so much for me today. Mrs. Chen, you're not imposing at all, Mark assured her. After what you went through this morning, I think you deserve something good to balance it out. Besides, I love talking to young people who are passionate about cars. It would be my pleasure. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an older model flip phone, the kind that younger people often found amusing but which served her simple communication needs perfectly. Mark didn't comment on the phone's age, instead helping her navigate to Tommy's number in her contact list. When Tommy answered the phone, his grandmother's voice was filled with excitement. Tommy dear, you're never going to believe what's happening to me right now. I'm sitting in the bank with that actor you're always talking about, the one from those car movies. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by Tommy's skeptical teenage voice. Grandma, what are you talking about? What actor? Margaret handed the phone to Mark, who accepted it with an amused grin. Hey Tommy, this is Vin Diesel. I'm here with your grandmother at the bank, and she tells me you're a big car enthusiast. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted several seconds before Tommy's voice exploded with excitement. No way. No freaking way. Grandma, is this really happening? Is Vin Diesel actually talking to me right now? Mark laughed, enjoying Tommy's genuine enthusiasm. It's really happening, man. Your grandmother just had a rough morning, but she handled herself with real class and dignity. You should be proud to have such a strong woman in your family. For the next few minutes, Mark engaged Tommy in a conversation about cars, mechanics, and the technical aspects of the Fast and Furious films. He answered questions about which cars were real and which were special effects, shared stories about working with professional drivers, and even offered some advice about pursuing automotive careers. Margaret watched this interaction with growing amazement. Here was one of Hollywood's biggest action stars taking time out of his day to make her teenage grandson's dreams come true. All because she had needed help with a simple banking transaction. The generosity of spirit that Mark was displaying seemed almost too good to be true. When Mark handed the phone back to Margaret, Tommy was practically incoherent with excitement. Grandma! Grandma! Did that really just happen? Vin Diesel knows who I am. He said I should keep working hard on cars. Wait until I tell everyone at school. Margaret smiled wider than she had in months as she listened to her grandson's joy. Yes, dear, it really happened. And you know what? He's just as nice as he seems in interviews, maybe even nicer. After she hung up the phone, Margaret turned to Mark with tears in her eyes again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than humiliation.
You have no idea what you just did for that boy.
He's had a difficult year with his parents' divorce, and he's been struggling with his confidence. What you just gave him will mean the world to him. Mark felt a warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with box office numbers or critical reviews. This was the kind of moment that reminded him why he had gotten into entertainment in the first place. To bring joy to people's lives and make positive connections with audiences. I'm glad I could help, Mark said sincerely. But you know what, Mrs. Chen? Tommy isn't the only one who impressed me today. The way you handled that difficult situation with grace and dignity, even when you were being treated unfairly, shows real strength of character. Your grandson is lucky to have you as a role model. Margaret felt her cheeks flush with pleasure at the compliment. It had been a long time since anyone had praised her for anything beyond basic politeness. Thank you, Mark. That means more to me than you know. Most days, I feel like the world has passed me by, like I'm just an old woman getting in everyone's way. That's not true at all, Mark replied firmly. You're a human being with dignity and worth, regardless of your age. What happened with that teller earlier was completely unacceptable, and it says nothing about you and everything about her attitude. They continued talking for another 15 minutes, with Margaret sharing stories about her late husband, her career as a teacher, and her current life as a widow learning to navigate the world alone. Mark listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering observations that showed he was truly engaged with her story. Margaret found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone since Walter's death. There was something about Mark's authentic interest and non-judgmental attitude that made her feel safe to share her fears and struggles. She told him about her loneliness, her concerns about becoming a burden to her children, and her frustration with a world that seemed to be changing faster than she could adapt. Mark shared some of his own experiences with family, talking about his mother's influence on his values and his efforts to stay connected to the real world despite the surreal nature of Hollywood fame. He spoke about the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their status or circumstances. As their conversation continued, other bank customers and employees occasionally glanced their way, but the intense scrutiny from earlier had faded as people returned to their own business. Marcus, the helpful teller, stopped by during his break to check on Margaret and was introduced to Mark properly. "I want to apologize for what happened earlier, Mrs. Chen," Marcus said sincerely. "That's not how we want any of our customers to be treated, especially not someone who's been with us as long as you have." Margaret waved off his concern graciously. "You were wonderful, Marcus. You saved the day. Not everyone can be as helpful as you are." As Marcus returned to his duties, Mark realized that their time together was probably drawing to a natural conclusion. Margaret seemed much more composed and confident than she had been when he first approached her, and he could see that her dignity had been fully restored. "Mrs. Chen," Mark said as he prepared to stand up, "I want you to have my assistant's contact information. If you ever have any problems like this again, or if there's anything else I can do to help, I want you to know that you have friends who care about what happens to you."
Margaret looked at the business card Mark handed her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief.
"I couldn't possibly use this. You've already done far too much for me." "Please keep it anyway," Mark insisted. "You never know when you might need it, and I would consider it an honor to help you again if the opportunity arose." As they stood up together, Margaret felt transformed from the broken, humiliated woman who had been crying at the teller window less than an hour ago. Her interaction with Mark had reminded her that she still had value as a person, that her dignity was intact, and that there were still kind people in the world willing to stand up for what was right. As Margaret and Mark prepared to leave their seats in the bank's waiting area, neither of them realized that their interaction had already begun creating waves that would extend far beyond the marble walls of the Wells Fargo branch. Several other customers had discreetly captured portions of their conversation on their phones, not out of malice or desire for social media fame, but because they had witnessed something genuinely moving and wanted to preserve it. Jennifer Martinez, a young marketing professional who had been waiting in line behind Margaret during the original incident, had been so affected by what she witnessed that she felt compelled to document it. She had started recording when Mark first approached to help, and she had captured the entire transformation from a humiliating confrontation to a heartwarming conversation between two people who had become unlikely friends. "Excuse me," Jennifer said, approaching Mark and Margaret as they gathered their belongings. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted you both to know that what I witnessed today was incredible. Mrs. Chen, the way you handled yourself with such dignity was inspiring. And, sir," she turned to Mark, "what you did was exactly what this world needs more of." Margaret smiled warmly at the young woman. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you to say." Mark nodded his appreciation, but seemed slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone should do in that situation." "But that's the thing," Jennifer continued earnestly. "Most people wouldn't have done anything. Most people would have just stood in line and felt bad about what was happening but wouldn't have gotten involved. You actually stepped up and made a difference." Jennifer hesitated for a moment, then continued, "I hope you don't mind, but I recorded some of what happened, not to exploit it or anything like that, but because I thought it was important to preserve something so beautiful. Would it be okay if I shared it? I think people need to see that there are still good people in the world who are willing to help each other." Margaret looked to Mark uncertainly, unsure about having her difficult moment broadcast to strangers. Mark considered the request thoughtfully. He was generally cautious about unsolicited recordings, but he recognized that the message Jennifer wanted to share was one that could genuinely benefit others. "Mrs. Chen," Mark said, "it's entirely up to you. This is your story as much as it is mine." Margaret thought about her grandson Tommy and how excited he had been about their encounter. She thought about other elderly people who might be facing similar challenges with bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to exclude rather than include them. Finally, she thought about the possibility that sharing their story might encourage other people to help when they witnessed unfair treatment.
"If you think it might help other people, then yes," Margaret said to Jennifer.
"But please make sure people understand that Marcus, the teller who helped us, was wonderful. Not everyone at the bank was unkind." Jennifer promised to include that important detail and thanked them both sincerely before heading off to her own banking business. As she walked away, Mark and Margaret exchanged contact information properly, with Margaret carefully writing down Mark's assistant's phone number in her small address book. "I want you to promise me something, Mrs. Chen," Mark said as they prepared to part ways. If you ever encounter anything like what happened here today, or if you need any kind of help at all, I want you to call that number. Don't suffer in silence when there are people who care about your well-being. I promise, Margaret replied, meaning it sincerely. And I want you to promise me something too. Promise me that you'll give my grandson a call sometime when you have a few minutes. Not because you have to, but because talking to you today will probably be one of the highlights of his entire year. Mark smiled and agreed readily. As they walked toward the bank's exit together, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. The simple act of being treated with kindness and respect had renewed her faith in humanity and reminded her that she still had value in the world. Outside the bank, they said their goodbyes with a warm embrace that felt natural despite having known each other for less than an hour. Mark watched as Margaret walked confidently toward her car, her posture straighter and her step more assured than when he had first seen her crying at the teller window. As Mark drove away from the bank, he found himself reflecting on the morning's events. In a business where so much attention was focused on box office numbers, awards, and industry recognition, his interaction with Margaret had reminded him of what really mattered. The genuine gratitude in her eyes and the joy in her grandson's voice had been worth more than any professional accolade. Meanwhile, Margaret drove home with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She couldn't wait to tell her daughter about what had happened, not just because of the celebrity encounter, but because of the reminder that there were still good people in the world willing to stand up for what was right. When Margaret arrived at her small apartment, she immediately called her daughter Susan, who lived across the country in Ohio. Susan had been worried about her mother's increasing isolation and had been encouraging her to consider moving closer to family or into a senior living community.
"You'll never believe what happened to me today," Margaret began, launching into the full story of her morning at the bank.
She described the initial humiliation in detail, wanting Susan to understand how low she had felt, before moving on to Mark's intervention and their subsequent conversation. Susan listened with a mixture of concern about the poor treatment her mother had received and amazement at the kindness shown by a complete stranger. "Mum, that's incredible. Are you sure you're okay, though? That teller's behavior sounds absolutely unacceptable." "I'm more than okay, honey," Margaret assured her daughter. "Yes, what happened with that teller was upsetting, but the way Mark stepped in to help reminded me that I don't have to accept poor treatment just because I'm older. I have value and dignity, and there are people who recognize that." Susan could hear a strength in her mother's voice that had been missing for months. The confidence and self-assurance that had characterized Margaret throughout her teaching career seemed to be returning, sparked by a simple act of human kindness. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself thinking frequently about her conversation with Mark and the lessons it had taught her. She began approaching her daily activities with renewed confidence, speaking up for herself when necessary and engaging more actively with the world around her. When she went grocery shopping, she struck up conversations with other customers and store employees. When she visited her doctor's office, she asked questions about her treatment options instead of simply accepting whatever was suggested. When she attended her weekly senior center activities, she found herself taking on small leadership roles that she had previously avoided. The transformation in Margaret's demeanor was noticed by everyone who knew her. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, commented on how much brighter and more energetic Margaret seemed. The staff at her doctor's office remarked on her increased engagement with her healthcare decisions. Even the mail carrier mentioned to Margaret's daughter that Mrs. Chen seemed to be doing much better lately. Meanwhile, Jennifer's video of the bank interaction had begun circulating on social media platforms, where it was being shared thousands of times per day. The video showed the clear contrast between Sarah's dismissive treatment of Margaret and Mark's compassionate intervention, followed by glimpses of their conversation and Margaret's obvious transformation from distressed to dignified. The response to the video was overwhelmingly positive, with viewers praising both Margaret's grace under pressure and Mark's willingness to help a stranger in need. Many people shared their own stories of witnessing or experiencing ageism and discrimination, while others were inspired to pay more attention to opportunities to help others in their own daily lives. The video caught the attention of several news outlets, who reached out to interview the participants about their experience. Mark's publicist was initially concerned about unsolicited media attention, but when Mark saw the positive nature of the coverage and the meaningful conversations it was generating about treating elderly people with dignity, he decided to embrace the opportunity. Margaret, meanwhile, was approached by local news stations who wanted to interview her about her experience. Initially hesitant about public attention, she ultimately agreed to participate when she realized that sharing her story could help other seniors who might be facing similar challenges. In her television interview, Margaret spoke eloquently about the importance of maintaining dignity at all stages of life and the power of standing up for others who are being treated unfairly. She praised Mark for his kindness but emphasized that anyone could have made the same choice to help. The real hero in this story isn't the movie star who helped me, Margaret said during her interview. The real hero is anyone who chooses to stand up for someone else when they see unfair treatment. We all have the power to make someone's day better, and we all have the responsibility to treat each other with basic human dignity. The interview was broadcast nationally and further amplified the positive message that had emerged from a simple banking transaction gone wrong. Margaret's words resonated with viewers across the country, many of whom were inspired to examine their own behavior and look for opportunities to help others in their communities. As the story continued to spread, Margaret found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for elderly rights and dignity. She began receiving invitations to speak at senior centers, community groups, and even some corporate training sessions about customer service and treating all people with respect regardless of their age or perceived status. The attention was overwhelming at first, but Margaret discovered that she had a natural talent for public speaking that drew on her decades of teaching experience. She found great satisfaction in using her platform to advocate for better treatment of elderly people and to encourage others to stand up for those who might not be able to advocate for themselves. 6 months after the incident at Wells Fargo, Margaret Chen stood at the podium of the Los Angeles Convention Center, looking out at an audience of over 500 people who had come to hear her speak at the National Conference on Aging with Dignity. The transformation from a humiliated elderly woman crying at a bank counter to a confident advocate for senior rights had been remarkable. But it was only the beginning of a much larger story. Margaret's speech that day was titled, "The Power of Standing Up: How One Act of Kindness Changed Everything."
As she began speaking, her voice was clear and strong, carrying the authority of someone who had found her purpose later in life than most people, but with a depth of conviction that came from genuine experience.
6 months ago, I was just another invisible elderly person navigating a world that seemed designed to make me feel irrelevant, Margaret began.
I had accepted that being dismissed, ignored, or treated with impatience was simply part of growing older in America. I thought that dignity was something I had to give up gradually, piece by piece, as I became more dependent on systems I didn't understand and couldn't control. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as Margaret recounted the details of her experience at the bank. She described the humiliation, the fear, the sense of helplessness that had overwhelmed her as she stood there crying in front of strangers, who seemed more annoyed than concerned about her distress. But then something happened that changed not just my day, but my entire perspective on what it means to grow older in this world, Margaret continued. A stranger stepped forward and reminded me that I still had value, that I deserved to be treated with respect, and that there were people willing to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't convenient or expected. Margaret went on to describe her interaction with Mark, but she was careful to emphasize that the lesson wasn't about celebrity intervention or fame. The lesson was about the choice that every person faces when they witness unfair treatment: to look away and stay comfortable, or to step forward and make a difference. The man who helped me that day happened to be famous, and that's why our story spread around the world, Margaret explained. But the principle he demonstrated can be practiced by anyone, anywhere, at any time. Each of us has the power to recognize the dignity in others and to insist that they be treated accordingly. The speech continued for 30 minutes, during which Margaret shared statistics about ageism, personal stories from other elderly people who had contacted her after seeing the viral video, and practical suggestions for how individuals and institutions could create more inclusive environments for aging populations. When Margaret finished speaking, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes. People in the audience were visibly moved, many wiping away tears as they considered their own experiences with elderly family members or their own fears about growing older in a society that often devalues aging. During the question and answer session that followed, Margaret demonstrated the same grace and thoughtfulness that had impressed Mark during their first conversation. She answered questions about policy recommendations, personal coping strategies, and the ongoing relationship she had maintained with the actor who had changed her life. "Sinclair and I have remained friends," Margaret shared when asked about Mark. "He calls regularly to check on me, and he's become like an adopted grandson. But more importantly, he taught me that my worth isn't determined by my age or my ability to navigate modern systems perfectly. He reminded me that I'm a person who deserves respect, and that reminder changed everything." After the conference, Margaret was approached by dozens of people who wanted to share their own stories or ask for advice about dealing with discrimination and dignity issues. She listened to each person carefully, offering guidance based on her own experience and the wisdom she had gained through her unexpected journey into advocacy work. Among those who approached her was Dr. Payne. Sarah Williams, a geriatrician who had been working on developing better patient care protocols for elderly populations. Dr. Williams was so impressed by Margaret's presentation that she invited her to consult on a new training program for healthcare workers. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Williams explained, "What you've learned about maintaining dignity while navigating complex systems is exactly what we need to teach healthcare providers. Would you consider working with us to develop training materials that could help doctors, nurses, and support staff provide better care for elderly patients?" Margaret accepted the invitation enthusiastically, recognizing it as an opportunity to make her experience useful to thousands of other elderly people who might benefit from more compassionate healthcare interactions. Over the following months, she worked with Dr. Williams' team to create training videos, written materials, and workshop curricula that emphasized the importance of treating elderly patients as whole people rather than collections of medical problems. The healthcare training program became wildly successful, with hospitals and medical schools across the country implementing Margaret's recommendations for improving elder care. Her emphasis on simple courtesies like making eye contact, speaking directly to elderly patients rather than their family members, and taking time to explain procedures clearly, resonated with healthcare workers who often felt rushed and overwhelmed by their responsibilities. Meanwhile, Mark had been following Margaret's advocacy work with pride and amazement. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into a movement that was making real differences in how elderly people were treated across multiple industries and institutions. He found himself reflecting regularly on how much he had learned from his brief interaction with Margaret and how it had influenced his own approach to fame and responsibility. During a break in filming his latest movie, Mark decided to surprise Margaret by attending one of her speaking engagements unannounced. He arrived at a senior center in Pasadena, where Margaret was scheduled to give a presentation about advocating for yourself in medical settings. When Margaret saw Mark enter the room, her face lit up with genuine joy and surprise. After her presentation, they had an opportunity to catch up privately, and Mark was struck by how much Margaret had grown in confidence and purpose since their first meeting. "You know, Mrs. Chen," Mark said as they sat together in the senior center's garden, "when I helped you at the bank that day, I thought I was doing you a favor. I had no idea that you were going to turn around and teach me so much about what really matters in life." Margaret smiled, the same warm expression that had touched Mark's heart during their first conversation. "We helped each other, Mark. You reminded me of my worth, and I think maybe I reminded you of yours too. Not the worth that comes from being famous or successful, but the worth that comes from being kind to other people." Their conversation was interrupted by Tommy, Margaret's grandson, who had driven down from San Francisco to attend his grandmother's presentation. Now 17 and working part-time at an auto repair shop, Tommy had been profoundly influenced by his grandmother's transformation and by the ongoing friendship she had maintained with his hero. "Vin Diesel," Tommy exclaimed, still unable to quite believe that he had a personal relationship with one of his favorite actors. "Grandma told me you were going to try to make it today. This is so cool." Mark stood to greet Tommy with a warm handshake and genuine interest in the young man's progress. Over the past 6 months, they had maintained occasional contact through phone calls and text messages, with Mark offering encouragement about Tommy's automotive interests and Tommy providing updates about his work and school activities. "How's the job at the garage going?" Mark asked, remembering details from their previous conversations. "It's amazing," Tommy replied enthusiastically. "I'm learning so much, and my boss says I have real natural talent for diagnostic work. I've been accepted to a technical college program that starts next fall, and I'm so excited I can barely stand it." Margaret watched the interaction between Mark and her grandson with deep satisfaction. The relationship that had developed between them was genuine and meaningful, based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than celebrity fascination. Tommy had grown more confident and focused over the past months, partly due to his grandmother's example of transformation, and partly due to having an adult mentor who took his goals seriously. As the afternoon progressed, Mark, Margaret, and Tommy were joined by several other people from the senior center who recognized Mark and wanted to thank him for his kindness to Margaret. Each person had their own story about how Margaret's advocacy work had influenced their approach to standing up for themselves or helping others in their community. Eleanor, an 82-year-old former librarian, shared how Margaret's example had inspired her to file a complaint against a medical practice that had been dismissive of her concerns about medication side effects. The complaint had resulted in improved communication protocols and better treatment for all of the practice's elderly patients. Robert, a 75-year-old retired engineer, described how he had started volunteering to help other seniors navigate online systems and digital banking after hearing Margaret speak about the importance of mutual support among elderly people. His volunteer work had helped dozens of people maintain their independence and avoid situations similar to what Margaret had experienced at the bank. Maria, a 69-year-old widow, talked about how Margaret's advocacy for dignity had inspired her to return to college to finish the degree she had abandoned 40 years earlier to raise her children. At nearly 70, she was thriving in her studies and had become an inspiration to younger students who admired her determination and life experience. As Mark listened to these stories, he realized that his simple decision to help a stranger had created ripple effects that extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. Margaret's transformation had inspired dozens of other people to make positive changes in their own lives and communities, creating a network of mutual support and advocacy that continued to grow. The success of Margaret's advocacy work had also led to concrete institutional changes beyond the healthcare training programs. Several major banks, including Wells Fargo, had implemented new customer service protocols specifically designed to better serve elderly customers. These changes included mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, improved accessibility features, and designated specialists to help customers navigate complex transactions. The Wells Fargo branch where Margaret's original incident had occurred had become a model location for elderly-friendly banking services. Marcus, the helpful teller who had resolved Margaret's transaction, had been promoted to a customer service specialist position where he focused specifically on helping elderly customers and training other employees in best practices for serving aging populations. Sarah, the teller whose poor treatment of Margaret had started the entire chain of events, had initially been resistant to the changes implemented after the incident went viral. However, after participating in mandatory sensitivity training that included watching Margaret's speeches and learning about the impact of ageism, she had experienced her own transformation. Sarah eventually reached out to Margaret directly to apologize for her behavior and to thank her for using the experience to create positive change. Their conversation was difficult but ultimately healing for both women, and Sarah had become one of the bank's most effective advocates for treating all customers with dignity and respect. As the sun began to set over the senior center's garden, Mark prepared to leave for his hotel. He had an early morning flight back to the film set, but he was grateful for the opportunity to see how much good had grown from their chance encounter. "Mrs. Chen," Mark said as they prepared to say goodbye, "I want you to know that meeting you has been one of the most important experiences of my life. You've taught me about courage, dignity, and the power of turning pain into purpose. Thank you for letting me be part of your story." Margaret embraced Mark warmly, this man who had become such an important part of her family's life. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth helping when I couldn't see it myself. You saved me that day, but more importantly, you reminded me that I had the power to save myself." As Mark drove away from the senior center that evening, he reflected on the profound truth that Margaret had helped him understand. Real heroism wasn't about spectacular stunts or dramatic rescues. It was about choosing to treat every person with dignity and respect, especially when they were vulnerable or struggling. It was about recognizing that everyone had value and potential for growth, regardless of their age or circumstances. Margaret's story had become a testament to the transformative power of kindness, but it had also become something more. It had become proof that it's never too late to find your voice, never too late to make a difference, and never too late to discover that your experiences, even the painful ones, can become gifts that you offer to the world. The legacy of that Tuesday morning at Wells Fargo continued to grow, touching lives and creating positive change in ways that neither Margaret nor Mark could have anticipated. It had become a reminder that in a world often focused on youth, beauty, and power, the simple act of treating an elderly person with dignity could spark a movement that would benefit countless others for years to come.